The loaf hit the dirt before Hannah Carter could catch it. Cyrus Deland had swatted it clean out of her hands right there on the boardwalk in front of the Mercantile, and the whole of Red Willow, Montana, turned to watch a fat woman drop to her knees in the mud to save one honest loaf of bread. The crowd laughed. Somebody spat. And Hannah, 26 years old and alone in the world, gathered the ruined bread against her apron like it was the last thing on earth that still belonged to her, and did not cry where they could see. Before we go on, if you're out there listening, do me a kindness. Subscribe to this channel and follow Hannah's story clear to the end. And leave a comment telling me the town you're watching from tonight, so I can see how far this story of mine has traveled. Now settle in, because you have not heard a story like this one. Cyrus Deland stood over her with his thumbs hooked in his belt, grinning at his friends. "Look at her scramble," he said. "Reckon she'll eat it right off the ground. Woman that size don't let good food go to waste." The laughter came again, easy and cruel, the kind of laughter a town practices until it don't cost them nothing. Hannah pushed herself up. Her knees were soaked through. The loaf in her arms had split along the crust and taken half the road with it, and she knew already there'd be no selling it now, no getting back the flour or the wood or the hour of her life it had cost her. "That bread was 3 cents, she said. Her voice came steady, which surprised her. 3 cents you just knocked into the mud, Mr. Deland. Then send the bill to your daddy." Cyrus wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Oh, that's right. Can't." Something went quiet in Hannah then, not weak. Quiet the way the air goes quiet before weather. She held his eyes long enough that his grin slipped a hair, and then she turned and walked back up the boardwalk toward the little bakery with her parents' name still painted over the door. Carter's. Bread and fine baking. The paint had faded some. She hadn't the money to freshen it, and even if she had, she wasn't sure she could climb the ladder to do it. Behind her, she heard a woman's voice, Prudence Vale by the pinch of it carry across the street. "Poor thing thinks she can run a business, in that body. Her mother, God rest her, would be ashamed to see the state of that shop." Hannah did not turn around. She had learned these last 4 months that turning around only gave them more to aim at. She stepped inside and shut the door and stood a moment with her back against it, holding the broken loaf breathing. The shop was cold. She hadn't lit the big oven yet that morning, and the little cook stove in back gave off only the memory of heat. The shelves in front of her were near empty. 2 loaves, a half-dozen biscuits going hard, a single pie she'd made from the last of the dried apples, hoping somebody might have a wedding, or awake hoping wrong. She set the ruined loaf on the counter and looked at it. "Well," she said to the empty room to her mother and father who were not there. That's how they figured to say good morning. Her father used to say the oven didn't care who you were. Bread was honest. He told her back when she was a girl with flour to her elbows standing on a crate to reach the board. "Bread don't lie, Hannah girl. You give it patience, you give it honest hands, you give it a little love, and it gives you back exactly what you put in, every time. That's more than you can say for most people." She had believed him. She still did, God help her. It was near the only thing she had left to believe. The bell over the door jangled. Hannah straightened and put on the face she kept for customers. The hopeful one, the one that said, "Welcome even to people who'd never once meant her well." It was the widow Hollis. Martha Hollis from the little house behind the livery with her market basket on her arm and her shawl pulled tight. She was maybe 50 gray coming in at her temples, and she had a way of not looking at a person straight on, like she was used to the world giving her grief, and had decided to stop giving it a target. "Morning, Mrs. Hollis," Hannah said. "Morning?" Martha's eyes went over the near-empty shelves, and something crossed her face that Hannah couldn't name. Pity, maybe. Hannah had learned to hate pity almost as much as she hated the laughing. "I'll take a loaf, and 2 of them biscuits." "They're a day old, the biscuits. I'll give you 4 for the price of 2. "You'll give me 2 for the price of 2, Martha said, "and you'll charge me proper, or I won't come back." She set her coins on the counter, careful, one at a time. A body has to make a living, Hannah Carter. Even a body this town's decided to be small about. Hannah's throat tightened. It was the first decent word anybody had said to her in longer than she could rightly count. "Yes, ma'am," she managed. Martha took her bread. She did not smile exactly. Martha wasn't much for smiling, but she paused at the door with her hand on the latch. "I knew your mother," she said. She'd have knocked Cyrus Deland into next Tuesday for what he'd done out there just now. "I saw you watching." "I was." "You didn't say nothing." Martha's jaw worked. "No," she said. "I didn't. And I've been ashamed of myself the whole walk to your door." She let that sit. "There. Now we both know it. Good day to you." And she was gone. The bell swinging behind her, and Hannah stood alone again in the cold shop with 3 coins on the counter and a broken loaf beside them. And for the space of one long breath, she let herself feel exactly how tired she was. She set Martha's coins in the till and stood a moment, looking at the little sourdough starter she kept in its crock by the stove. The mother, her grandfather's mother, bubbling slow and patient, the way it had bubbled since before Hannah was born. There was a thing she had to do, and she had been putting it off since sunup because she already knew how it would go. She had to try Grady one more time. She took her shawl from the peg and her egg money from the tin, all $11 of it, because she wasn't fool enough to think Abel Grady would extend her another cent of credit, and she walked the 2 blocks to the mercantile with her chin up and her face set. And every step of it, she rehearsed what she'd say and how she'd say it, calm and reasonable. One merchant to another. The mercantile was warm and smelled of coffee and leather, and it went quiet when she stepped inside. Abel Grady stood behind his counter in his apron, a narrow man with a narrow mouth, and to one side by the bolts of calico stood Prudence Vale and 2 other churchwomen with their heads together, and they looked up at Hannah the way a cat looks up at a bird that's wandered too close. "Mr. Grady," Hannah said, "I'd like 100 pounds of flour. Your good white if you've got it, or the second grade if you don't." Grady wiped the counter with a rag that didn't need wiping. "Cash. I've got $11 here." She set it down. "That's most of it. I'll bring the balance Saturday out of the week's baking. I've never once failed to make good, Mr. Grady, you know that. My father never failed you in 20 years, and neither have I." "Your father," Grady said, "is dead." The word landed in the quiet like a dropped plate. Behind her, one of the churchwomen tittered. "That he is," Hannah said, and she was proud that her voice did not so much as tremble. "And I'm his daughter, and I'm standing here with cash money asking to do honest business. 100 pounds of flour, Mr. Grady." Grady looked at the $11 on his counter like it might be catching. "Word is," he said, "the bank's calling your note Friday. Word is you'll be shut by the weekend. Now what kind of businessman would I be extending credit to a woman that won't have a business to pay me back with? I'm paying cash. You're paying part cash." He slid the $11 back across the counter toward her with one finger. "I'll sell you what $11 buys and not a pound more. That's 20 pound of flour, Miss Carter, and you can carry it yourself because I've told the boy not to make deliveries out to a debt." 20 pounds, not 100. 20 pounds would give her one day's baking if that, and then the bin would be empty for good. "Mr. Grady." Hannah heard her own voice go low and steady the way her father's used to. "I have never once cheated a soul in this town. Not one. I've given day-old bread to hungry children for a penny that cost me a nickel to make. I've fed men who couldn't pay and never spoke of it. All I'm asking is the same faith my father earned in this store, and you're standing there talking to me like I'm a thief because a rich man decided to put me out." Prudence Vale spoke up from over by the calico, sweet as poison. "Listen to her carry on. As if the whole town's meant to prop up a business that can't stand on its own. Abel, don't you let her guilt you. If the woman managed her affairs half as well as she manages her supper table, she'd not be in this fix." The women laughed. Hannah did not turn around. She kept her eyes on Grady, and something in her face must have reached him some last thread of the shame she suspected he still carried under all that narrow meanness because he wouldn't meet her look. 20 pounds, he said again, quieter. "Take it or leave it." She took it. She counted out the coins, and she hefted the sack herself, 100 pounds worth of pride crammed into 20 pounds of flour, and she carried it out the door past the church. Women, past Prudence Vale, and Prudence said something to her back that Hannah did not let herself hear, and the whole way down the boardwalk to her own shop, Her arms burned and her eyes burned, and she did not set the sack down once, not once, because she would sooner have died than let them see her rest. That was the flour in her bin. 20 pounds less what she'd used already. 1 day's baking and no more coming, and $11 now become 4 in the till. 4 months. 4 months since the sickness came through Red Willow and took her mother in the night, and her father 4 days after both of them coughing blood into the same handkerchiefs Hannah had boiled and boiled and boiled, praying over the washpot like a fool who thought clean linen could fight the Lord's own arithmetic. 4 months since she'd buried them side by side on the rise east of town, in ground so hard the gravedigger charged her double. 4 months of waking before dawn to bake and standing behind that counter all the day long, and going up the narrow stairs at night to a room that still smelled faint of her mother's rosewater, and lying awake doing sums that never once came out in her favor. She'd inherited the bakery. Everyone said so like it was a gift. She'd inherited the ovens, and the recipes, and the good name over the door. And she'd inherited, too, the note her father held with Thorne's Bank, and the back taxes, and the bill at Grady's Mercantile for flour and sugar bought on credit against a spring that never came. And she'd inherited it, turned out a town that had loved her parents and could not abide their daughter. They'd been kind enough while grief was fresh. Casseroles on the step, a hand on the shoulder at the burying. But grief has a shelf life in a town like Red Willow, and once the casseroles stopped, the whispering started, and Hannah came to understand the shape of the thing they'd never said to her mother's face, and had been saving up all these years. That she was fat. That a fat woman had no business being seen, let alone being looked at, let alone standing behind a counter asking honest folk for their money. That whatever her father's bread had been, it curdled somehow coming from her hands. That she ought to be smaller, quieter, gone. She had heard it all. In the mercantile. Through the window. From the mouths of children who'd learned it from their mothers. And the terrible thing, the thing she could not say to a living soul, was that some low and beaten part of her had started to believe them. She looked down at her own hands on the counter. Flour worked deep into the knuckles, strong hands. Her father's hands, folks used to say before they decided the rest of her was a joke. She could hear him still if she was quiet enough. Her father at the board in the dark before dawn, teaching her the way you teach a thing you love. Feel it, Hannah girl. Don't look at it, feel it. Bread'll tell you what it needs if you got the patience to listen. Most folks ain't got the patience. That's why most folks can't bake worth a lick. She'd been maybe 9. Standing on the crate. Her hands too small to knead a whole batch, so he'd let her do the little rolls, and she'd been so proud, so terrible. Proud the day he sold a dozen of her rolls to the stage line and told the driver his daughter made them. Now here's the whole secret, and I'll only tell you the once. Her father, flour to his elbows, leaning down to her level. Anybody can follow a recipe. Recipe's just numbers. What you can't put in a recipe is the caring. You care about the man who's going to eat it. You don't know him, might never meet him, but you care about him, and you put that in with your hands, and somehow don't ask me how it comes out in the bread. Folks can taste caring, Hannah girl. They can't say what it is, but they can taste it. That's the difference between bread and just flour and water. That's the whole difference in everything you ask me. And her mother from the doorway, drying her hands on her apron. John Carter, you'll fill that child's head with poetry and she'll starve. She'll not starve. She's got better hands than me already, her father winking. Don't tell her, though. She'll get above herself. Hannah had believed she'd have years. That was the cruelty of it, the plain human cruelty of thinking there'd be time. She'd believed she'd stand at that board beside her father when she was 40, when she was 60, that she'd bury him old, that her mother would teach Hannah's own children the little rolls, the way she'd been taught. Instead, she'd nursed them both in 11 days. She'd held her mother's hand while it went cold, and she'd sat up the whole of the last night with her father, and near the end, when he could barely draw breath, he'd gripped her wrist and pulled her down close. The book, he'd whispered. You keep the book. Everything's in the book, Hannah. Everything I know. You keep it, and you keep the mother going, that starter. Don't you let it die, and you keep on baking honest, and you'll be all right. You hear me? Whatever they say to you, you keep on baking honest. That's how you win. Not by proving nothing to nobody. You just keep on." Those were near the last words her father spoke to her. Whatever they say to you, you keep on baking honest. She had not understood then that there would be so very much for them to say. "No," she said out loud now to the empty shop, and she wasn't entirely sure what she was saying no to. No. She spent the morning the way she spent all her mornings now, which was to say, waiting. The bell did ring once, near 9, and Hannah's heart jumped up, hoping the way it always did. It was Prudence Vale come in with 2 of her friends, and Hannah knew inside of a breath that they hadn't come to buy anything. "Well," Prudence said, looking around the shop with her nose lifted. "So this is where the famous Carter bread comes from these days. I do declare it's a smaller operation than it was in your mother's time. Morning, Mrs. Vale. Can I get you something? The sourdough's fresh." "Oh, I'm only looking." Prudence drifted along the near-empty shelf, trailing one gloved finger. "My husband did so love your mother's seed cake. Ruth Carter, now there was a baker. Slim as a reed her whole life, even after children. Some women keep themselves. And some—" She let her eyes travel slow up and down the whole of Hannah, unhurried, making a meal of it. "Let themselves go entirely. It's a want of discipline, my mother always said. And if a woman can't manage her own person well, however's she to manage a business?" One of the friends laughed behind her glove. Hannah stood very still behind the counter with her hands flat on the wood. "Was there a loaf you wanted, Mrs. Vale?" she said. "Or did you just come to look at me?" Prudence's smile thinned. "I beg your pardon. I asked, did you want bread? Because I've bread to sell, and if you're buying, I'll wrap it. And if you're not, then you've had your look, and I've got work." Hannah's voice never rose. That was the thing. It never once rose. "So which is it?" For a moment, Prudence Vale had no words at all, which Hannah reckoned might be a first in the history of Red Willow. Color came up in the older woman's cheeks. "Come along, girls," Prudence said at last, drawing herself up. "I can see the grief has affected her mind. Talking to her betters that way." She swept toward the door and turned at the last and fired her parting shot low and quiet, where it would do the most damage. "Enjoy your Friday, Miss Carter. I hear it's to be your last." The bell jangled. They were gone. And Hannah stood there with her hands flat on the counter, shaking just a little now that no one was there to see, and she made herself breathe, and she made herself let it go, because her father's voice was in her ear. "You keep on baking honest. That's how you win." Nobody came for the next 2 hours. The 2 loaves sat. The pie sat. Around 10, she watched through the front window as 3 women stopped on the boardwalk directly across right, where they knew she could see, and looked at her shop, and looked at each other, and moved on to buy their bread off the back of a wagon that came down twice a week from Miller's Landing. Miller's bread was gray, and it went stale by supper, and everybody knew it. And they bought it anyhow, because buying it meant not walking through Hannah Carter's door. She understood the arithmetic of that too. At 11:30 the bell rang, and Hannah's heart did the foolish thing it always did, jumped up, hoping, and then fell when she saw who it was. Silas Thorne. He came in the way. He came in everywhere, like the room ought to be grateful. He was a tall man, gone soft in the middle, dressed too fine for a Tuesday, with a gold chain across his vest, and rings on 2 fingers, and a smile that never once reached the top of his face. He owned the bank. He owned, folks said, near 1/3 of the paper in the county. Notes and liens and mortgages held quiet in his big iron safe. And he had a way of appearing at a man's door the very week that man's luck turned, which some called good business, and others more quietly called something else. "Miss Carter." He removed his hat with great courtesy, and did not mean a lick of it. "I do hope I'm not interrupting the rush." Hannah's hands went still on the counter. "Mr. Thorne, I'll come straight to it as I know your time is valuable." He looked around the shop, the empty shelves, and let his gaze linger just long enough to make his point. "Your father's note. You're 3 payments behind. 3 Miss Carter. I've been more than patient. I'd hate for the town to say Silas Thorne turned a grieving orphan out of doors, so I've held off. But a bank is not a charity. You understand." "I understand you've been paid something every month," Hannah said. Even the months I ate one meal a day to do it. Something is not the payment. He said it gently, which was worse than if he'd shouted. The note comes due in full principal and arrears on the first of the month. That's Friday. Unless you can bring me $140 by Friday, the property reverts to the bank. He set his hat back on. It grieves me, truly. Your mother made a fine seed cake. $140. Hannah had $11 and some cents in the coffee tin upstairs, and 3 cents more on the counter that Martha Hollis had just paid her, and there was no earthly way between now and Friday that the difference could be made up baking bread nobody in this town would buy. He knew it. She could see he knew it. That was the whole of the thing. You want this building, Hannah said slowly. Something flickered behind Thorne's eyes. I want my note satisfied. No, she was watching him now, watching close the way you watch a dog you're not sure of. My father paid 20 years on this lot. Paid it near clean. He told me. He sat right at that table upstairs the winter before he died, and he told me the note was down to almost nothing, that another good year would see it clear. Almost nothing, Mr. Thorne. And now you stand here telling me it's $140? For just a moment, the gentle smile went somewhere else. Your father, Thorne said, was an optimist. Grief plays tricks, Miss Carter. A young woman under strain alone, no head for figures. It's understandable you'd misremember. The papers are the papers. They're in my safe, signed in your father's own hand, and they say what they say. He touched his hat brim. Friday. I'd hate to send Cyrus to change the locks. The bell rang behind him, and he was gone out into the sun, and Hannah stood gripping the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles went white. Signed in your father's own hand. Her father's hand. She knew that hand. She'd learned her letters from that hand. Big, careful capitals on a slate. John Carter writing out recipes in a book she still had upstairs. Every loaf and cake and pie her family had made for 2 generations set down in ink that hadn't a single flourish to it, because her father had been a plain man who wrote the way he baked, honest and square and no showing off. The papers are in my safe. She would never see those papers. That was the trick of it, wasn't it? He held the papers, and he held the story, and a fat orphan girl with no lawyer and no money and no friend in the whole of Red Willow could hold nothing at all. Hannah went into the back and sat down heavy on the flower stool and put her face in her hands. She was still sitting there when she heard the child. A small voice out front. Miss Carter, you in there. She wiped her face quick and came out. It was the Pruitt boy, Tommy, 7 years old, with a cowlick that wouldn't lie down and holes in both knees of his breeches. His family lived out past the smithy dirt poor, and Hannah knew for a fact his mother had died the same winter as her own folks. I'm here, Tommy. What is it? The boy stood on his toes to see over the counter. He had a penny clutched in his fist, held out like an offering. Pa says I can have a biscuit if you got a day-old one cheap. He give me a penny. His eyes went to the shelf. Are them day-old? They were 2 days old and going to be firewood by supper. They surely are, Hannah said. And for a customer like you, I got a special price. A penny gets you 2. She put 4 in a twist of paper, folded it over so he couldn't count, and set it on the counter. There now. Tommy's face opened up like a window. He set the penny down with great ceremony. Thank you, ma'am. He clutched the biscuits to his chest. And then at the door he stopped and looked back at her with a child's terrible plainness. Miss Carter, how come nobody buys your bread? Pa says it's the best bread in the whole territory. He says your pa's sourdough could make a grown man cry. Hannah had to look away out the window a moment before she could answer. I don't rightly know, Tommy, she said. I don't rightly know. Well, I think folks is dumb. And he was gone off down the boardwalk with his 4 biscuits, 7 years old, and worth more than the whole rest of the town put together. Hannah picked up the penny. Warm from his fist. She set it in the till beside Martha's 3 cents, and looked at the 4 cents there, and did the arithmetic she'd been avoiding all morning. She hadn't gotten far into it when the bell rang again, and this time it was Cyrus Deland. He came in without taking off his hat, which told her plenty, and he leaned against her doorframe with his thumbs in his belt and looked around the shop the way a man looks at a thing he's already decided he owns. "Miss Carter." He said the miss like it tasted funny. "Mr. Thorne sent me. Says to tell you he's a Christian man, and he don't like to see a woman put out in the cold foreclosure being such an ugly public thing. So he's making you an offer, out of the goodness of his heart." "Is he?" "He'll buy the place off you. Clean. No foreclosure, no fuss, no sheriff nailing paper to your door for the whole town to gawk at." Cyrus grinned. $30. You sign it over to him tomorrow. You take your $30 and your recipe book and whatever fits in a bag, and you catch the Thursday stage to wherever fat women go. Denver, maybe. Nobody knows you in Denver. $30. For the building. For the ovens her grandfather laid brick by brick. For 20 years of her father's payments and 2 generations of her family's name over the door. $30 and get out of town before you embarrass anybody further. Hannah looked at Cyrus Deland a long moment. "You knocked my bread in the mud this morning," she said. Cyrus shrugged. "It was funny. And now you're standing in my shop, offering me $30 for everything my family ever built." She tilted her head. "Tell me something, Cyrus. Why's Mr. Thorne so anxious to buy a failing bakery? If I'm shut Friday anyhow, if it's all going to the bank anyhow, why's he sending you around today with $30 cash and a stage ticket all in a hurry, all so quiet?" The grin faltered. Just a hair. But she saw it. "He's being kind," Cyrus said. "He's being fast." Hannah leaned forward over the counter. "A man in a hurry to buy a thing quiet is a man who's afraid of what happens if he waits. Now what would Silas Thorne have to be afraid of from a fat girl he's already beaten? You watch your mouth." "You take him my answer." She straightened up. "You tell Mr. Thorne that Hannah Carter said no. Not $30, not $300. You tell him I'll see him Friday, and not 1 hour sooner, and you tell him I said to bring the papers. All of them. Every last one out of that iron safe of his. You tell him I'm real anxious to have a look at those papers." The two of them stood there, and something passed between them, and for the first time since her folks died, Hannah watched a man of Red Willow look at her and not feel entirely sure of himself. Cyrus recovered quick. He always did. "You're going to regret that," he said. "You'll be on the street Friday wishing you'd took the 30. "Maybe so. Now get out of my shop. You're letting the heat out, and I've baking to do." He went. He slammed the door hard enough to rattle the glass, and Hannah watched him stride off up the boardwalk toward the bank, walking fast, walking to report. And she stood behind her counter with her heart going like a hammer, and thought, "I'm right. Whatever it is, I'm right. He's afraid of something. There's something he doesn't want me to see before Friday." She didn't yet know what. She was about to find out. 4 cents in the till. $11 become 4. 140 owed by Friday. Or so a liar had told her. She went out back to the flour bin because a body has to know exactly how bad a thing is before she can decide what to do about it. And she lifted the lid, and she looked inside. There was flour enough for 1 day. Maybe. 1 good day of baking if she scraped the corners and didn't waste a cup. That was all. That was the end of it. After tomorrow, there'd be no more flour and no money to buy more and no more credit at Grady's, who'd cut her off a month back, and on Friday the locks would change and Silas Thorne would have his building, the one her father paid 20 years on, the one where she'd learned her letters and lost her mother and buried the only life she'd ever known. She stood there a long while with her hand on the cold edge of the flour bin. Then she went upstairs. She went up the narrow stairs to the little room over the shop, and she lit the lamp, and she took down from the shelf the recipe book. Her father's book, the leather cracked and the pages gone soft with 40 years of handling. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, and she opened it, meaning only to look at his handwriting, meaning only to feel close to him for a minute in the worst hour of her whole life. And a paper fell out. It slid from between the pages of the sourdough recipe, the very first recipe in the book, the one her grandfather had brought from the old country, and it fell to the floorboards, and Hannah bent and picked it up. It was a receipt. She held it near the lamp. It was a receipt from Thorne's bank dated the previous spring in her father's plain square hand, and stamped besides with the bank's own seal. and it recorded a payment against the note. A large payment, larger than any single payment Hannah had known her father to make. And at the bottom in that same bank's ink was a figure, a running balance, the amount still owed after that payment had been credited. $19. Hannah read it 3 times to be sure her eyes weren't lying to her out of hope. $19. Not 140. Not near it. Her father had been telling the truth at that winter table. The note was down to almost nothing, and here in her hand was the bank's own paper, stamped and dated and stamped again, that said so. Silas Thorne had looked at her in the eye that very morning and told her she owed $140. He had called her father an optimist, and her a grieving girl with no head for figures. He had counted on her having nothing, knowing nothing, being nothing but a fat orphan too beaten down to fight. He had not counted on this. Hannah sat on the edge of the bed with the receipt shaking in her hand, and it was not fear that shook it. It was something she had near forgotten she owned. "Oh, you liar," she whispered. "You bald-faced liar." She thought of Cyrus knocking the bread into the mud. She thought of Thorne's soft, gentle smile. She thought of the whole town's laughing, and how easy it had been for them to decide she was worth nothing, and how much easier that had made it for a rich man to reach out quiet and take everything her family had built. And Hannah understood all at once, sitting in that lamp-lit room with her father's book open on her knees, that the laughing had never really been about her body at all. Not the deepest part of it. The laughing was a thing done to a person so that no one would come to her aid when the taking started. You made a woman a joke first. You made the whole town comfortable being small about her. And then when the banker came for her building, not one soul in Red Willow would lift a hand, because who lifts a hand for a joke? It was a fine plan. It had very nearly worked. And it explained everything. It explained why Cyrus had come with $30 and a stage ticket and such a powerful hurry. Thorne didn't want a foreclosure. A foreclosure meant a courthouse and a judge and papers laid out on a table where anybody might look at them. Thorne wanted her signature on a bill of sale, freely given $30 in her hand, and a stage out of town so that when he took the property, nobody could ever say she hadn't sold it willing. He wanted her gone before Friday, before anyone thought to ask what the note really said, because the note was near paid. And a near paid note that a bank calls in full is not business. It is theft. It is theft, with a seal on it done to a woman the whole town had already agreed to look away from. Hannah pressed the receipt to her chest with both hands. "You wanted a joke," she whispered, and she was not talking to the empty room. Now she was talking to Silas Thorne clear across town in his fine house. "You needed me to be a joke so nobody'd come when you robbed me. Well." Her voice broke and steadied and came back harder. "I ain't a joke. I'm John Carter's daughter, and you've made one mistake I don't think you can fix." She thought of her father gripping her wrist. "You keep the book. Everything's in the book." He hadn't meant only the recipes. Somehow, at the end, some part of him had known. He'd tucked the bank's own receipt into the sourdough page, the first page, the page he knew his daughter would open when things got darkest. Because where else does a Carter go when the world's caving in but to the bread? He'd left it for her like a lamp in a window. "Everything's in the book, Hannah." She had thought an hour ago that she had nothing. She had the truth in her 2 hands, stamped and dated, and impossible to argue with, and she had 4 months of being small and beaten and laughed at turning over inside her chest into something else entirely. But it had one flaw in it that Silas Thorne, for all his rings and his iron safe, had never considered. He had never once tasted her bread. Hannah stood up. She wiped her face with the heel of her hand. She went to the window and looked down at the street at Red Willow, going about its afternoon at the wagon from Miller's Landing, and Prudence Vale gossiping on the corner, and Cyrus Deland lounging outside the mercantile, and she felt the fear that had lived in her chest for 4 months turn over slow and become something with an edge to it. She had flour enough for one day. She had $11.04. She had a receipt that could put a banker in a courtroom if she could ever get anyone to look at it, if she could survive to Friday, if the whole town didn't watch her turned out first and call it a good riddance. But she had one more thing besides, and it was the only thing that had ever really been hers. She had her father's word and her mother's hands, and 40 years of honest bread in a cracked leather book, and she was going to bake. She was going to bake tomorrow like she'd never baked in her life, one perfect day, the last of the flour, every loaf made exactly the way her folks had taught her. With patience, with honest hands, with love, not for the town, for herself, for John and Ruth Carter, in the hard ground east of town. For the plain truth that a person's worth is not decided by the people laughing loudest, and never was and never would be. She went back down the stairs. She banked the little stove and set her sourdough starter where it would stay warm through the night, the mother that her grandfather had brought across an ocean, bubbling and alive, older than anyone living in Red Willow. She measured what flour she had. She set out her father's book to the first page. She laid a clean cloth over the board. She was still working when the bell rang soft this time, and Martha Hollis stepped in out of the dusk with her shawl pulled tight and her mouth set in a hard line. "You ought to lock this door," Martha said. "It's a bakery, Mrs. Hollis. Locking the door rather defeats it. There's men gathering across the street." Martha jerked her head at the window. "Cyrus and his lot, and some others. They've got it in their heads to come watch you shut. I heard it in the mercantile. Grady's letting them use his boardwalk." She looked at Hannah, and this time she looked at her straight on, no sliding away. "I thought you ought to have some warning, so you could pull the curtain, sit in the back, not give them the show they come for." Hannah kept kneading. She didn't look up. "I'll not be pulling any curtains," she said. "Hannah, I've pulled every curtain there is to pull these 4 months, Mrs. Hollis. I've made myself small in every way a body can make herself small, hoping if I got small enough they'd leave off. It doesn't work. You can't get small enough for people like that. There's no bottom to it." She turned the dough folded. It pressed it down with the heels of both hands. "So no. Let them come watch. Let them see the light on in my window and me at my board. I'm going to bake tonight, and I'm going to bake tomorrow, and I'll not hide from a soul while I do it." Martha stood there in the doorway a long moment. "Your mother," she said at last, "was exactly this stubborn. Drove me half to distraction 40 years I knew her." Something worked in the older woman's throat. "You want to know why I didn't say nothing this morning when Cyrus knocked your bread down, when you were on your knees in that mud? You don't have to tell me. I do, though." Martha's hands twisted in her shawl. "Because I've spent 30 years learning to keep my head down. Widow with no money, you learn quick that the nail sticking up is the one gets hammered. I kept my head down and I stayed small, and I watched them do to you what they've done to me half my life, and I told myself it wasn't my fight." She stopped. "And I've been sick with myself all day, because it is my fight. It's every woman in this town's fight, and we've all of us been too scared to say so." She came to the counter. She set something down on it, careful the way she'd set down her coins that morning. It was money, $2 in coins, more than a widow of her means could rightly spare. "That's for flour," Martha said. "I know it's not much. I know it won't buy what you need. But I couldn't just come warn you and walk out. I couldn't do that twice in one day." She lifted her chin. "So there. I'm in it now. God help me, I'm in it." Hannah looked at the $2 on her counter and then at Martha Hollis, and she felt something come loose in her chest that had been wound tight since the first shovelful of dirt hit her father's coffin. "Mrs. Hollis," she said, and had to stop and start again. "You keep your $2, but you come by in the morning, early, before light." "What for?" "Because I'm going to bake the best bread this town has ever put in its mouth tomorrow, and I could use a pair of honest hands." Hannah managed something that was almost a smile, the first in a long while. "And because I think it's time somebody in Red Willow stopped keeping her head down. Both of us. Together." Martha Hollis looked at her a long moment. Then she nodded once hard. "Before light," she said. "I'll be here." And she went, and the bell rang soft behind her, and Hannah stood alone in the warm shop with $2 she hadn't taken and a promise she meant to keep. She was still standing there in the last of the light when she heard the laughter start up again outside. She went to the window. Word had gotten around the way it always did. Somebody Cyrus most likely had let it out that Friday was coming, that the bank was calling the Carter note, that the fat girl was finished at last, and they'd come to look. Not a mob, nothing so honest as a mob. Just folks. Just Red Willow gathering loose on the boardwalk across the way in the falling dark, pointing at the shop. Laughing the easy, practiced laughter of people who've decided that a woman's ruin is a thing worth watching for sport. Prudence Vale, with her hand to her mouth. Two of the mercantile men. A knot of boys throwing pebbles at her window and running. And Cyrus Deland in the middle of it, arms crossed, grinning up at the light in her shop. "Last night in business, Carter," he called loud enough to carry. "Better bake yourself something nice to remember it by." The laughter rolled. Hannah stood at the window and looked out at all of them, at the whole town that had decided she was a joke, and she did not step back from the glass, and she did not draw the curtain, and she did not cry. She let them see her face. And then she turned, and she went to the great brick oven at the back of the shop, the one her grandfather had built with his own hands, the one that had baked bread for Red Willow for 40 years, and she opened the iron door, and she began to lay the fire. She struck the match. She held it a moment, the small flame steady in her fingers, and she thought of her father saying, "The oven. Don't care who you are," and she thought of her mother's rosewater, and she thought of Tommy Pruitt saying folks is dumb, and she thought of Silas Thorne's soft lying smile, and she thought that whatever else Friday brought, they were all of them about to find out what one woman could do with a single day's flour and 40 years of love baked into her hands. She set the match to the kindling. The fire caught and climbed and threw its light across her face, and Hannah Carter, 26 years old, and alone in the world, and not finished, not near finished, not by a mile, watched the flames take hold, and knew that whatever this town believed tomorrow, she would bake the truest bread of her life. Outside they were still laughing. They would not laugh long. Martha Hollis came before light just as she'd promised, rapping her knuckles soft on the back door, while the whole rest of Red Willow still slept off its cruelty. "You look like you didn't sleep a wink," Martha said, shedding her shawl. "I didn't." Hannah already had her apron on, and flour to her wrists. "I baked half the night. Come look." She'd been at it since the town's laughter died away, since the last lamp across the street went dark, and left her alone with the oven, and her grief, and the receipt she'd folded small and pinned inside her bodice, where no hand but hers could reach it. She had baked the way her father taught her. She had baked like it was the first day and the last day both. And now she pulled back the cloth on the cooling board and let Martha see what one woman could do with the last of her flour, when she had stopped at long last being afraid. Martha went still. There were loaves there like Martha had not seen since Ruth Carter was alive. High and proud and blistered gold across the crust, the sourdough scored in the old way, the smell of them filling the shop so thick you could near lean on it. Martha reached out and touched one careful, like it might be too fine to touch. "Hannah Carter," she breathed. "Lord above, your mother never baked better." "My mother baked this," Hannah's voice caught. "I just kept the mother going like Pa said. It's all of them in here. Every Carter that ever stood at this board." She wiped her hands. "Now, we've got maybe 4 hours of selling before the bank comes Friday. I aim to sell every last loaf, and I aim to do it with the whole town watching. They'll come to watch sure enough." Martha tied on the spare apron. "They won't come to buy. Then we'll see who's got the stronger stomach. Them for their spite, or me for standing here." Hannah set the first loaves in the window, right up against the glass where the morning would light them like something in church. Let them look. They worked. They worked fast and easy, the two of them, the way women work who've each carried too much alone and are grateful past speaking to have another pair of hands beside them. "Can I ask you something?" Martha said, shaping a loaf, not looking up. "Aren't you scared standing up like this? Putting the bread in the window where they can all see you fail, if you do fail?" "I'm terrified." Hannah slid a peel into the oven. "I've been terrified 4 months straight. That's the thing nobody tells you, Mrs. Hollis. Being brave ain't the same as not being scared. I figured that out somewhere around 3 this morning." She shut the iron door. "Being brave is baking the bread anyway, putting it in the window anyway, letting them watch anyway. The scared part don't go nowhere. You just stop letting it hold the pen." Martha was quiet a moment. "Your mother said things like that," she said. "Word for word near enough." She set her loaf down. "All right then. We'll be terrified together and put the bread in the window anyhow." "That's the whole plan." Martha handled the counter. Hannah handled the oven. And by the time the sun cleared the false fronts across the street and Red Willow began to stir, the little bakery was warm and bright and stacked with more good bread than it had held in 4 months. The trouble was, nobody came. Oh, they came to the street. By 9 there was a knot of them gathered on Grady's boardwalk across the way, same as the night before, come to see the fat girl shuddered at last. Prudence Vale in her Sunday bonnet on a Wednesday. 2 of the mercantile men with their coffee. Cyrus Deland with his boot up on a rail chewing a matchstick watching Hannah's door like a cat at a mouse hole. "She's put bread in the window," Hannah heard one of the men say through the glass. "Like anybody's buying." "Fool woman," said Prudence. "Baking on her last day. Denver bound by Sunday, mark me." Cyrus grinned around his matchstick and called across loud. "Morning, Carter. Real pretty bread. Shame there's nobody in this whole town'll touch it." Hannah came to the door. She did not shout. She never once shouted. "Bread's a nickel, Mr. Deland. Same as it's always been. You're welcome to buy, or you're welcome to stand there and watch your breakfast go cold." She smiled at him small and even. "Your choice." The laughter that answered was thinner than it had been the day before. Some of them had noticed the smell now drifting across the street. The smell of real bread. Honest bread, the kind their mothers made, and a man cannot laugh with his whole heart when his mouth has started watering against his will. But nobody crossed the street. 10 o'clock came, and the shelves stayed full. 10:30. Martha kept her chin up and her hands busy, but Hannah caught her doing the sums, same as Hannah was doing them, and the sums came out the same ugly way they always did. Full shelves. Empty till. Friday coming like a train. "Hannah," Martha said low, "I'll not lie to you. If not one loaf sells, I don't know how you make Thursday, let alone Friday." "One loaf will sell." Hannah's eyes were on the street. "One always does, you watch." At 11 one did. It was Tommy Pruitt's father, Ezra, a big stooped man who worked the smithy, and he came across the street slow and deliberate with every eye in town on his back. He did not look at the boardwalk crowd. He walked straight through Hannah's door and took off his hat. "Miss Carter." He set 2 nickels on the counter hard like he was making a point of it, which he was. "My boy says it's the best bread in the territory. My boy don't lie. I'll take 2 loaves." Hannah's hands shook just slightly as she wrapped them. "Thank you, Mr. Pruitt," she said. "How's Tommy?" "Fed now." Ezra tucked the loaves under his arm. At the door he paused and turned and pitched his voice to carry clean across the street to the boardwalk. "My wife's buried up on that same rise as your folks, Miss Carter. Good people don't get treated the way this town's treating you. I'm ashamed to share a street with the lot of them." And he walked back out straight through the middle of them, and not one soul said a word to his face. 2 nickels in the till. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But Hannah held on to the moment like it was worth $10, because for 4 months not one grown man in Red Willow had crossed that street for her, and now one had, and had said out loud what she'd near stopped believing anybody thought. She did not have long to hold it, because that was when the street went quiet. Not the quiet of the crowd hushing. A different quiet. The quiet a town makes when a certain kind of man rides into it. Hannah felt it before she understood it, the way the boardwalk crowd shifted and straightened, the way the matchstick came out of Cyrus Deland's mouth, the way even Prudence Vale closed her own. "Well now," Martha murmured, looking past Hannah out the window. "There's a thing." A rider had come up in the middle of the street and swung down easy and looped his reins at Hannah's own rail, and the whole of Red Willow had stopped to watch him do it. "Who is that?" Hannah said. Martha's voice had dropped to something near reverent. "That girl is Nathaniel Brooks. Owns the Brooks spread out past the river. Biggest cattle operation in 3 counties. Runs 100 hands, maybe more." She paused. "He don't come to town but 4 times a year, and when he does, men that owe money find somewhere else to be." Hannah watched the man cross her boardwalk. He was maybe 38, built long and hard the way a man gets from 30 years of honest work, and no time for softness, dressed plain, but for the quality of the leather, and he moved like the ground belonged to him, and he knew it, and didn't need to say so. He did not look at the crowd on Grady's boardwalk, not once. He looked at the loaves in Hannah's window, and something in his face changed, some tightening of attention, and then he opened her door, and the bell rang, and he stepped inside. He took off his hat. "Ma'am," he said. "Sir." Hannah's heart was going hard. She could not have said why. He didn't speak right away. He stood before the window loaves, and he studied them the way another man might study a horse he meant to buy, or a hand of cards worth real money. He leaned close. He looked at the crumb where one loaf had been cut. He looked at the blister of the crust, the depth of the color, the way the scoring had opened. Then he said something no man had said to Hannah Carter in the whole of her life. "Who taught you to bake like this?" Hannah blinked. Of all the things, not a word about her body, not a flicker of his eyes doing the thing every eye in this town did, just the bread, only the bread. "My father," she said, "and his father before him. 3 generations, sir." "That's a wild yeast crumb." He nodded at the cut loaf. "You keep a mother going." Now it was Hannah's turn to go still. "You know baking." "I know good work when I taste it. And I know bad bread because I've been feeding 100 men gray sawdust off a wagon from Miller's Landing for 2 years and listening to them gripe about it." He straightened up. "How old's your starter?" "Older than this town. My grandfather carried it across the ocean in a crock wrapped in his coat." Hannah found the words coming easier now, the way they always did when the talk was of the craft. "You feed it right. Keep it warm. It never dies. My father's last words to me were, 'Don't let the mother die.'" Nathaniel Brooks looked at her a long moment. Behind him, pressed up against the window half of Red Willow, strained to see what the richest man in 3 counties wanted with the fat girl they'd all agreed to ruin. "Cut me a slice," Nathaniel said. Hannah cut him a slice. She cut it from the loaf she was proudest of, the one she'd pulled at 3 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, and she laid it on a clean square of paper and set it before him, and she watched the toughest man in the territory pick it up in fingers that had roped 10,000 head of cattle, and she stopped breathing entirely. He tasted it. He did not gulp it down. He tore a piece, and he chewed it slow, and he closed his eyes for the space of 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, the whole shop and the whole street and the whole of Hannah's ruined year hung on a thread. Out on the boardwalk, they were straining now, every one of them. Prudence Vale up on her toes. Grady leaning off his own step, a dozen faces pressed toward the glass, to see the verdict of the one man in the county whose word actually moved money. They had come to watch. Hannah shuddered. They found themselves watching something they had no name for yet, and it made them uneasy, and not one of them could look away. He opened his eyes. "Ma'am." Nathaniel Brooks said quietly, "That is the best bread I have put in my mouth since I was a boy at my mother's table. And my mother's been 30 years in the ground." The words landed in Hannah like water on cracked earth. She had to look down at the counter. She could not have spoken if her life hung on it, which in a way it did. Out on the street, Cyrus Deland's voice cut through the glass, ugly and desperate, because Cyrus had felt the ground shift and did not like the feeling. "Don't let her fool you, Mr. Brooks," he called. "That woman's finished. Banks got her Friday, and well." He laughed, but it came out wrong. "Look at the size of her. Woman can't keep her own self in line. How's she going to keep a business?" The whole street heard it. Nathaniel Brooks set his slice of bread down on the paper careful, and turned around and walked to Hannah's open door and looked out at Cyrus Deland across the street with an expression that made 3 grown men take a step back off the boardwalk. "What did you say?" Nathaniel said. He didn't raise his voice either. He didn't have to. "About the woman who baked the finest loaf in Montana." Cyrus's mouth opened and shut. "I asked you a question, son." Nathaniel came out onto the boardwalk one slow step and settled his hat on his head. "You were saying something about her size. Go on, say it again. Say it to me this time, and not to a woman working alone." The silence stretched until it hurt. "I didn't mean nothing by it," Cyrus said. "No." Nathaniel's voice was flat as a table. "Men like you never do. You mean everything by it, and then you don't mean nothing soon as somebody bigger than the woman turns around." He looked slow along the whole boardwalk crowd, Prudence Grady in his apron, the mercantile men letting his eyes rest on each of them, one at a time. "I've bought cattle off half of you. I've bought feed and leather and rope in this town for 20 years. And in 20 years, I never once saw a thing as low as a whole town of grown people ganging up to laugh a grieving girl into the grave over the shape of her body." He let that sit. "You ought to be ashamed, every last one of you, and I mean to give you a reason to be." He turned his back on them like they weren't worth the watching and stepped back inside to Hannah's counter. And he reached into his coat. Hannah's breath stopped again. For one wild instant, 4 months of being cheated and lied to made her think of the receipt pinned inside her dress. Made her think this too must be some trick, some new way for the world to knock her bread into the mud. But it was not a trick. It was an envelope. He set it on the counter between them, thick and folded, and put one broad finger on it and slid it toward her. "Open it," he said. She did. Her hands were not steady. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in a plain square hand, not so different from her father's, and a contract set out on it in terms even a woman doing sums by candlelight could read at a glance. Fresh bread, delivered daily, to Brooks Ranch, for every man on the place. "I run 112 hands through the busy season," Nathaniel said, while Hannah read it 3 times over, same as she'd read the receipt the night before, unable to trust her own eyes. "Never fewer than 80 in winter. Every one of them eats 3 times a day, and every one of them has spent 2 years cursing that Gray Miller bread and me for buying it. I've been looking a long while for somebody who could do better." He nodded at the loaves in the window. "I found her this morning. If she'll have the work. If she'll—" Hannah started and stopped and started over. "Mr. Brooks, that's more bread in a week than I've sold in 4 months. That's I'd have to bake through the night, I'd have to hire, I'd have to buy flour by the barrel. I pay a month in advance." Nathaniel said it plain, like it was nothing, like it wasn't the difference between a grave and a life. "First payment on signing. You'd have the cash in hand today, enough to buy your flour and hire your help and settle whatever needs settling." His eyes flicked just once toward the window and the town beyond it. Whatever needs settling by Friday. He knew. Of course he knew. The whole town had been shouting it across the street, and he had walked in anyway and tasted her bread anyway, and made his decision on the strength of her hands, and not one thing else. Out on the boardwalk, something was happening. The crowd that had come to watch Hannah shuddered, was watching something else entirely now, and they did not like the look of it, and Hannah saw the exact moment the news reached the one man in Red Willow it would hurt the most. Because Silas Thorne was coming up the street. Fast. Hatless. His fine coat flapping his soft face gone the color of tallow, and Cyrus Deland scurrying at his elbow, having plainly run to fetch him the second the ground began to shift. Thorne came through Hannah's door without knocking, without his usual courtesy, without the gentle lying smile. "Brooks." He was breathing hard. "A word." "Thorne." Nathaniel didn't turn all the way around. "I'm conducting business. That's exactly what I'm here about." Thorne got himself between Nathaniel and the counter between Nathaniel and Hannah and lowered his voice like the whole street wasn't leaning at the glass to hear. "Whatever this woman's told you, you ought to know the truth before you sign a thing. This property reverts to my bank Friday. She's insolvent. Bankrupt. She'll not have a bakery to bake your bread in by the weekend. You'd be signing a contract with a ghost." He tried the smile, now tried to bring it back. "I'm doing you a kindness telling you. Businessman to businessman." And there it was. The whole plan laid bare in front of everyone. Get her gone quiet before Friday. Scare off the one man who might save her. Make sure the fat girl was ruined before anyone thought to ask a single hard question. Hannah felt the receipt against her ribs like it was burning. "Is that so?" Nathaniel said. And now he did turn slow to face the banker full on. "Insolvent." That's a big word for a man who's been feeding on this town like a tick for 30 years. How much does she owe you, Thorne? Thorne hesitated. Half a heartbeat. But Hannah saw it. That's confidential bank business. How much? $140, Thorne said, and arrears due in full Friday. I've been more than patient. $140. Nathaniel's voice didn't change, but something in it had gone very cold and very quiet. I've got that in my saddlebag right now, Thorne. I'd write it out this minute and clear her free, and then where's your Friday? He watched the banker's face. But that's the strange thing, ain't it? You don't look like a man about to have his note paid. You look like a man about to have something taken away from him. You misunderstand my concern, Thorne said, but the tallow color had spread, and Hannah, who had spent 4 months small and silent and swallowing every lie this man fed her, reached up and unpinned the folded paper from inside her bodice and laid it flat on the counter and smoothed it out with one floured hand. Then let's clear it up right now, she said. Her voice never rose. It never once rose. Mr. Brooks, before you pay a dime to this man, you might want to see what's owed against what he says is owed. Thorne's eyes dropped to the paper. Hannah watched him read it. She watched him understand what it was. She watched the exact instant the soft, gentle lying went out of Silas Thorne's face and left nothing behind but the fear that had been under it the whole time. Where did you, he started. My father's own hand. Your bank's own seal right there at the bottom, dated last spring. Hannah tapped the figure with her floured finger slow, so everyone crowding the doorway could see her do it. It's a receipt, Mr. Thorne, for a payment you took and credited, and it shows the balance owed on this property after that payment. You want to read out that number, or shall I? Thorne said nothing. $19, Hannah said to the whole shop, to the whole street, to the whole town that had laughed. 19, not 140. You've been standing in my shop telling me I owe you $140, and this here says the truth, and it's got your own bank's stamp on it. The doorway was packed now. Prudence Vale had a hand over her mouth. Grady had come across his own street without seeming to notice he'd done it. And the silence in that shop was a different silence than any Red Willow had made all week, because it was the silence of a town watching a thing it had been sure of, turn suddenly and completely inside out. That receipt is a forgery, Thorne said. His voice had gone thin. It's got your seal on it. Seals can be faked. That paper proves nothing. But he had said it too fast and too loud, and every soul jammed in that doorway heard the difference between a man stating a fact and a man who has just seen the edge of a cliff. Faked. Hannah kept her eyes on him steady. Then you'll not mind a judge in Helena comparing it against your own ledgers. Mr. Thorne, you keep ledgers, don't you? Every bank keeps ledgers. Mine says $19. What does yours say? She let the question hang. Because if they don't match, only one of us has been doing the forging, and it ain't the woman who just found her own father's receipt tucked in a recipe book. Thorne's jaw worked. He had no answer. Everyone in that doorway watched him have no answer, and the not answering was louder than anything he could have said. Nathaniel Brooks picked up the receipt. He read it once unhurried and set it back down in front of Hannah and looked at Silas Thorne for a long, long moment. You know what I think, Nathaniel said. I think you called a note near paid in full on a grieving woman with no lawyer because you figured nobody in this town would lift a finger to stop you. I think you needed her small. I think you needed the whole town laughing so loud nobody'd hear a robbery happening underneath it. He nodded slow. That's a smart plan, Thorne. That's a real smart plan. It's got just the one flaw. And what? Thorne bit out. Is that? She kept the receipt. Nathaniel picked up his pen, the pen he'd brought to sign a bread contract, and he held it out to Hannah across the counter past the banker over the man's soft, shaking shoulder. Sign my contract, Miss Carter. Take my month in advance. Pay this man his $19 if you even owe him that much, which I doubt, and get yourself a lawyer out of Helena who don't drink at the same table as Silas Thorne. Because I don't believe a $19 note calls due at 140 by accident. I believe that's how a man like him has been doing business in this town for 30 years, and I believe you're the first one ever caught him at it." Hannah took the pen. Her hand was steady now. That was the thing she would remember after when she told it. Her hand had shaken over the receipt the night before, and shaken over the contract a moment ago. But when she set the pen to Nathaniel Brooks's paper and signed her name, Hannah Carter, in the same plain square letters her father had taught her on a slate, her hand did not shake at all. Thorne watched the ink dry. He knew what it meant. Everyone in that doorway knew what it meant. It meant she'd have money by nightfall, and flour by morning, and a lawyer by the week's end, and a witness like Nathaniel Brooks, who'd watched him call a paid note due and try to run a rival off with a lie. "You've made a mistake," Thorne said. "It came out weak. Both of you. You've no idea what you've started." "I got a fair idea," Nathaniel said. "I've been wanting a reason to look into your books a good long while, Thorne. Half the men you've ruined in this county are friends of mine." He tucked the signed contract into his coat. "You go on home now. And you have those papers of yours ready, all of them, because I expect there's going to be a judge wanting to see them real soon. And judges, unlike this town, ain't so easy to make laugh." Silas Thorne looked around the shop one last time, at the loaves in the window, at Martha Hollis with her arms crossed and something fierce and glad breaking over her tired face. At the town crowded in his path, none of them meeting his eye now, all of them suddenly finding it very interesting to study their own boots. And at Hannah Carter standing behind her counter with flour to her wrists and her father's receipt in her hand, and her name freshly signed to a contract that would keep her tall and unbowed, and no longer not by any measure a joke. He had nothing. For the first time in 30 years, Silas Thorne walked out of a room with nothing, and the bell over the door rang small and final behind him. Nobody laughed. That was the thing Hannah noticed. That was the thing that undid her after all the cruelty she'd stood up under dry-eyed. Nobody laughed. The whole crowd that had gathered to watch her fall stood there in her doorway and out on her boardwalk, and not one of them could find it in themselves to make a sound, because you cannot laugh at a woman who has just in front of your eyes refused to be broken. Nathaniel Brooks pulled a roll of banknotes from his coat and counted them onto the counter. More money than Hannah had held in a year, the first month paid in advance, just as he'd said. "That's for the bread," he said. "The rest is up to you." "Mr. Brooks." Hannah looked at the money and at him and had to breathe before she could get the rest of it out. "Why, you don't know me. You walked in a stranger. Why'd you do all this for me?" Nathaniel Brooks settled his hat. He was quiet a moment, and when he spoke it was lower meant more for her than for the crowd. "I didn't do it for you, ma'am. Not to start with." He nodded at the window loaves gold in the morning light. "I did it for that bread. A man who runs 100 hard men learns quick that you can't fake quality, and you can't fake caring, and both of them were in that loaf plain as anything I ever tasted. I don't buy pity, and I don't sell it. I buy the best. And this morning the best in Montana was standing in a shop this whole town was too blind and too mean to walk into." He touched his hat brim. "The pity's on them, not you. Never was on you." He looked at her one moment longer than a man looks at a business partner. Just one. Then he turned and walked out through the crowd, and the crowd parted for him, and he swung up onto his horse and rode back out of Red Willow, the way he'd come, and left behind him a shop full of bread, a counter full of money, a town full of shame, and a woman who had woken up that morning believing it was the last day of everything she had. Hannah stood behind her counter and did not move for a long moment. Then Martha Hollis was beside her, gripping her arm hard, and Martha was laughing and crying, both at once, saying her name, saying, "Lord above," saying, "Did that just happen, girl? Did that, truly, just happen?" And the town began to break apart in the doorway, drifting back across the street in twos and threes, quiet, unable to look at each other, and here and there among them a face that had laughed the loudest, now wore something that was not quite an apology, but was the first cousin to one, and Prudence Vale of all people lingered at the door. She did not come in. She stood on the threshold with her Sunday bonnet askew, and she looked at the bread in the window, and she looked at Hannah, and for once in her small, hard life, she seemed to have no words at all. "I'll take a loaf," Prudence finally said. Stiff, barely above a whisper. The sourdough, if there's any left. Hannah looked at the woman who had trailed a gloved finger up and down her body and called it a want of discipline not a day before. There's plenty, Mrs. Vale, she said. And she wrapped it, and she charged her the same nickel she charged everyone, not a penny more, because her father's daughter did not know how to do it any other way. Thank you for your business. Prudence took the loaf. She opened her mouth and shut it and put down her nickel and left without another word. And it was the closest thing to a victory Hannah could have imagined, and it tasted of nothing at all, because Hannah had already learned the only thing that morning had to teach her. She counted the money again when they were alone. She sat down on the flower stool with the roll of banknotes in her two hands and Martha standing over her, and she counted it, and it was real every time she counted it. You know what this is, Martha said softly. A contract. No girl. Martha crouched down in front of her, took both her hands, money and all. It's a beginning. That's what it is. After everything, after all of it, it's a beginning. Her old eyes were wet. Your mother would be so proud she'd bust. You hear me? So proud. Hannah looked at the receipt still lying on the counter, her father's plain hand, the bank's own stamp. She thought of him tucking it into the sourdough page, the first page. The page he knew she'd open when the world caved in. Everything's in the book, Hannah. He hadn't meant only the recipes. Somehow at the end, coughing his life out, some part of John Carter had known his girl would need a lamp and had left her one. I'm not going to Denver, Hannah said. It came out of her sudden and fierce, and she gripped Martha's hands, and she said it again like a vow. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to keep this bakery, and I'm going to fill it, and I'm going to bake for 100 men who've never tasted a thing this good in their lives, and I am never ever going to make myself small in this town again. Her voice broke on the last of it, and held. Not for Thorne. Not for any of them. Not for one more day of my life. No, Martha said, and squeezed her hands hard enough to hurt. You're not. And you won't stand alone doing it neither. I told you last night. I'm in it now. Outside, the morning went on. Red Willow went back to its business with its head down, and its shame fresh, and the wagon from Miller's Landing came and went with its gray bread, and for the first time anyone could remember sold near nothing. And in the little bakery with her parents' name over the door, Hannah Carter got up off the flower stool and put the banknotes safe in the tin, and pinned her father's receipt back inside her bodice, where she could feel it against her heart, and tied her apron tighter and went back to her oven. There was so much bread to bake now. She had never in her life been so glad of the work. The work near killed her the first 2 weeks, and she blessed every hour of it. She was up at 2 now, not 4. The oven roaring before the town's roosters found their voices, and she baked until the light was long gone, and her back would not straighten, and her hands, her father's strong hands, cracked and blistered and bled into the flour, so that more than once she had to stop and bind them before she could go on. 112 men ate 3 times a day. That was bread by the wagon-load bread in numbers that made her old sums look like a child's, and the first delivery near broke her before it started. It won't all fit, Martha said, staring at the order slip. Hannah, there isn't an oven in this county could turn out this much in a night. Then we bake all night and half the day. Hannah was already at the board. We bake in shifts. We don't sleep till it's loaded. Mr. Brooks paid a month in advance, and I will not be the reason that wagon rolls up short on the first morning. They did not sleep. They baked through the dark and into the dawn, the 2 of them, and when the Brooks wagon rolled up at first light with a young foreman on the seat, there was bread stacked to meet it, every loaf counted, every loaf perfect, and Hannah stood in her doorway with flour in her hair and blood on her bindings, and watched them load it, and did not let herself sit down until the wagon was clean out of sight. Then she sat down on her own boardwalk right there in front of God and the whole waking town, and put her face in her hands and shook. You did it, Martha said, easing down beside her just as spent. You did it, girl. One morning. Hannah's voice was hoarse. I did one morning. There's 29 more this month, and every month after. Then you'll do those too. Martha patted her knee. One morning at a time. That's the only way anybody's ever done anything hard. The bread answered before the men did. Word came back off the brook spread inside 3 days, carried by hands who rode into town of a Saturday and could not stop talking about it, and what they said spread through Red Willow like a grass fire. Best I ever ate. A young hand named Willis told the whole of Grady's counter, loud not caring who heard. 2 years of that Gray Miller slop and now this. There's fellas out there'd fight you for the heel of a Carter loaf. Fight you, I seen it. That should have been the end of the doubting. It was not, of course. Because a town that has decided to be small about a woman does not surrender the habit easy. And by the end of that first week, the whispering had simply changed its tune. Hannah heard the new tune from Prudence Vale's own back in Grady's, where she'd come to order flour by the barrel now and pay cash on the head of it. Well, of course Brooks buys from her. Prudence was saying, not troubling to lower her voice. Everyone knows why. The man felt sorry for her, standing there about to be turned out that great sad creature. It's charity, plain and simple, dressed up as a contract. It's got nothing to do with the bread. A man like Nathaniel Brooks taking pity. The word went through Hannah like a splinter. Pity. After everything. She set down her flour money, and she turned around, and Prudence had the grace to color. But Hannah did not fight her. She had learned that much. She simply looked at the woman a long, level moment. "Mrs. Vale," she said, "you've eaten my bread now. You bought a loaf yourself. Was that pity you tasted?" Prudence had no answer, and Hannah took her flour and left. But the word did not leave with her. It followed her home, and it sat in her chest all through that night's baking. Pity, pity. And somewhere near midnight, elbow deep in dough, she found she was crying, without having decided to big silent tears dropping into the flour. Because it was one thing to be laughed at for what you were, and another thing entirely to have the one good thing that had ever happened to you called an act of charity. She did not let it stop her hands. That was the whole trick, her father's trick, the only one she knew. She cried, and she kneaded, and she did not stop, and by dawn the bread was made, and the tears had baked away into nothing, and only the bread was left. Let the bread answer. It was the one argument she had never once lost. It was Nathaniel Brooks who answered the rest. He came into town that Saturday, which was 3 times more often than his 4 visits a year, though Hannah did not let herself make anything of that. He came into the mercantile while half of Red Willow was in it, and he found the conversation already running the way it always ran now. Cyrus Deland holding forth by the stove about how the whole Brooks contract was just a rich man's soft heart, how it'd dry up the minute Brooks got tired of playing the Good Samaritan. Nathaniel let him finish. Then he spoke easy and plain to the whole store. "I've made my money," he said, "buying the best beef, the best horses, and the best men I could find, and cutting loose anything and anybody that wasn't. Ask any man who's worked my spread. I don't keep a hand out of pity. I don't buy a steer out of pity. And I surely don't sign a year's contract and pay a month in advance out of pity, because pity's got a short memory, and my ledger's got a long one." He looked at Cyrus. "The Carter woman bakes the best bread I've had in 30 years. That's the whole of the reason, and there ain't another. Any man says different is calling me a fool with my own money, and I'd take it kindly if he'd say it to my face." Nobody said it to his face. He bought his tobacco, and he walked out, and on his way, he stopped at Hannah's shop and stood in her doorway with his hat in his hand, and Hannah came out from the back with her bindings on and her heart doing that foolish thing again. "Mr. Brooks, Miss Carter." He seemed like he had something to say and had not decided how to say it. "My men eat better than I do now. I wanted you to know it. There's men out there been hard cases their whole lives, men nobody's ever done a kind thing for, and they get to the end of a brutal day, and there's real bread waiting, bread that somebody made careful, and—" He stopped. "It does something to a man. Reminds him he's worth feeding right. I didn't expect that. I bought bread. I got something more than bread." Hannah did not trust herself to speak for a moment. "That's the caring," she finally said. "My father used to say it. Folks can taste caring even when they can't name it. I care about every man who eats a loaf of mine, Mr. Brooks. I never met most of them, and I care about them anyhow. That's the whole secret. There isn't another." Nathaniel Brooks looked at her, and something passed over his hard face that softened it in a way the town would not have believed possible. "No," he said quietly. "I don't suppose there is." He put his hat on. "Good day, Miss Carter." And he was gone, and Hannah stood there longer than she needed to, and Martha, watching from the flower bin, said not one word, though her old eyes were bright with everything she was too kind to say out loud. The girl came the following Monday. She could not have been more than 15, all elbows, and hunger in a dress gone gray from too many washings, and she stood in Hannah's doorway a long time before she worked up the nerve to come in. Hannah knew her by sight. Sadie Coates, from the county poor farm, out past the Dawson place. An orphan same as Hannah, was an orphan, now a girl the town had decided to be small about, long before it ever got around to Hannah. "They say you need help," Sadie said fast, like she had to get it all out before her courage failed. "For the ranch bread. I know I'm not much to look at, and I know folks say things about the poor farm girls, but I can work, ma'am. I can work harder than anybody. I don't sleep hardly at all, and I don't eat much, and I'll do whatever. I'll haul wood and wash pans, and I'll learn anything you teach me, only please, please." Her voice cracked. "Nobody in this town will hire a poor farm girl. Nobody. I've asked at every door. You're the last one." Hannah looked at this girl standing in her shop, scared and proud and starving and refusing to cry, and it was like looking into a glass at herself 4 months gone. "Can you get up at 2 in the morning?" Hannah said. "Yes, ma'am." "It's brutal work. Your hands will bleed. Mine still do." Hannah held them up, cracked and bound. "You see these? This is the job. It doesn't get gentler." "I don't want gentle." Sadie's chin came up, and there it was, the thing Hannah had been looking for, the thing that couldn't be taught. "I want work. I want to be some use to somebody. I'm sick to death of being nothing." "Then you're hired." Hannah said it before she'd half decided it, and watched the girl's whole face come apart. $2 a week, and all the bread you can eat, and a cot in the back, if the poor farm's as bad as I remember it being. And Sadie. She waited till the girl looked up. "In this shop, nobody's nothing. You understand me. I don't care what this town says about poor farm girls or fat girls or any other kind of girl. In here, there's just the bread, and the bread doesn't care who you are. Only whether you'll do the work honest." She held out one bound hand. "Will you?" "Yes, ma'am." Sadie took it like a drowning girl takes a rope. "I swear I will." And so there were 3 of them now, and the work that had near killed Hannah alone became something almost bearable. Split 3 ways, and Sadie Coates turned out to have quick hands and a good ear and a hunger to learn that reminded Hannah so hard of herself at that age, it made her throat ache. She taught the girl the way her father had taught her. Feel it, don't look at it. Bread'll tell you what it needs. And Sadie, who had never in her life been trusted with anything, listened like it was scripture. The orders grew. That was the thing that started to frighten Hannah in a good way, in a way she had forgotten was possible. The Dawsons, who ran the second biggest spread in the county, sent word they wanted in 40 hands worth, having heard their men grumbling that the Brooks outfit ate better. Then a boarding house in town. Then the stage line, the same stage line her father had sold her little rolls to 20 years back. Then a mining camp 2 valleys over sent a man on a mule with cash in his hat and a plea for anything that wasn't hardtack. And the Saturday came maybe 6 weeks in when Hannah looked up from her counter and saw a line. A real line. Out her door and down the boardwalk. The people of Red Willow, the same people who had laughed a grieving girl to her knees in the mud, standing in a patient line on a Saturday morning to buy Hannah Carter's bread, because it had gotten so that a body couldn't hold her head up at church if she was still buying gray slop off the Miller wagon. Cyrus Deland was not in the line, but his mother was, and Prudence Vale was near the back, her bonnet very straight, staring hard at the boardwalk boards like they owed her money. And when Prudence got to the counter, she did not say one word, just held up 2 fingers for 2 loaves, and Hannah wrapped them and charged her the same nickel apiece and said thank you for your business, same as always, same as she'd say to a queen or a beggar. And Prudence took her bread and fled. Martha watched her go. "That woman is choking on it," she murmured. "Having to stand in your line, it's killing her by inches." "Let it." Hannah reached for the next loaf. "I'm not in the revenge business, Mrs. Hollis. I'm in the bread business. She wants a loaf, she can have a loaf, same as anybody." She meant it too. That was the part the town could never quite forgive her for in the end. She would not hate them back. She just would not. Cyrus Deland came by that Saturday too, though not to stand in the line. He loitered across the street the way he used to, thumbs in his belt, watching the crowd file in and out of the door. He'd once knocked her bread down in front of, and Hannah caught him at it through the window and felt of all things something almost like pity for the man. He had built his whole small place in this town on being the fellow who could make the fat girl scramble in the mud, and now the fat girl had a line out her door and a contract with the richest man in 3 counties. And Cyrus Deland had nothing left to stand on but a habit that had gone sour. "He looks lost," Sadie said, following her gaze. "He is lost," Hannah said. "Men like that always are soon as the person they built themselves up by stops being smaller than them. Don't you pity him too hard, though. He's got 2 good hands and a strong back, and every chance in the world to be a decent man tomorrow that he wasn't today. That's more than a lot of folks get." She turned back to the counter. "Next loaf. We've a line to feed." It was that same good Saturday with the line out the door and money in the till, and Sadie singing to herself over the pans in the back, that the twist of the knife came the way it always seemed to come on Hannah's best days, as if the world could not abide her having one clean. A rider came in hard off the Brooks Road. Willis the young hand, the one who'd bragged at Grady's counter, only there was no brag in him now. He shoved through the line white as a sheet and gripped the counter. "Miss Carter, you got to come. You got to come now. Men are sick out at the ranch, real sick. 6 of 'em down since this morning, heaving, can't stand up, and—" He swallowed. "And they're saying it's the bread. They're saying it was your bread done it." The whole line went silent. The whole shop. Hannah felt the floor tilt under her. "My bread." She heard her own voice come out very far away. "My bread made men sick. Foreman thinks so. Mr. Brooks is out riding fence, don't even know yet. But the foreman's talking about tearing up the contract, and there's a fella out there, one of the new hands he come on just last week. He's the loudest of all, saying he seen you people were dirty. Saying poor farm girls in the kitchen saying—" Willis looked sick to say it. "Saying you'd poison a man for a nickel." Sadie had come out from the back and gone the color of ash. "It's me," she whispered. "They're saying it's me, because I'm from the poor farm. Miss Carter, I swear on my mother's grave, I never the pans were clean, I scrubbed everyone I know you did." Hannah caught the girl by both shoulders hard. "You listen to me. This is not your doing. Do you hear me? Not for 1 second do I believe my bread sickened anybody. And I know for a fact you scrubbed those pans because I watched you do it twice when once would have done." She was already untying her apron. "Willis, that new hand, the loud one. When'd you say he came on?" "Week back about." "And who sent him? Who vouched for him?" Willis blinked. I don't rightly know. Foreman took him on. Said somebody in town spoke for him." And there it was. Hannah felt it drop into place, cold and certain, the way the receipt had dropped into place that first night. A new hand appeared out of nowhere a week back, somebody in town speaking for him, and now he was the loudest voice screaming that Carter bread was poison on the very same Saturday her line ran out the door, and the whole county was clamoring to buy. "Somebody in town," Hannah said softly. "I'll just bet somebody in town." "You think Thorne?" Martha breathed. "I think Silas Thorne is looking at a judge and a ledger, and the end of everything he's built on lies, and I think a man like that would rather burn my whole reputation to the ground than let me stand up in a courtroom with any credit to my name." Hannah's jaw set. "You don't ruin a woman by outbaking her. You already tried that and lost. You ruin her by making folks afraid of the very thing she does best. Nobody buys bread they think'll make them sick. Not Brooks, not the Dawsons, not the stage line nobody. One rumor, and it's all gone. She grabbed her shawl. Martha, hold the shop. Sadie, you come with me. Me. Sadie looked terrified. You? Because they're saying it was you, and I'll be damned if I'll leave you here to hide while men call you a poisoner. We're going to go find out exactly what made those men sick, and we're going to do it together in front of everybody in the light of day. Hannah looked at the girl. Honest work has nothing to hide. That's the whole strength of it. Now come on. They rode out on the flour wagon, Sadie clinging to the seat, and the whole way Hannah did the thing she did best, which was think it through cold. 6 men down. Not all 112. 6. If it were her bread, if a whole batch had gone wrong somehow, it'd be dozens sick, not 6 because the whole outfit ate the same loaves. 6 men out of 100 meant it wasn't the bread they all shared. It was something only those 6 had touched. She found the foreman in the bunkhouse yard, a hard, worried man named Cobb, and 6 green-faced hands laid out groaning, and the new man, the loud one, a rat-faced fellow standing over them working the crowd. There she is, he crowed. The poisoner herself, come to finish the job. Hannah did not so much as look at him. Mr. Cobb. She kept her voice level and clear, so every man in that yard could hear it. These 6, what did they eat this morning that the other 100 didn't? Cobb frowned. They all ate the same. Bread and beans and coffee, same as always. No. Hannah shook her head. 6 out of 100 don't fall sick off food 100 ate. That's not how sickness works, and every mother in this territory knows it. So think, these 6. What's different about these 6? Cobb's frown deepened. He looked at the sick men, and one of them, gray and sweating, lifted his head off the ground and rasped it out. The jerky, he groaned. We split a sack of jerky, night hands, just us 6 on the fence line, bought it off. He stopped. His eyes found the rat-faced man and went wide. Off him. He sold it to us. Said it was a bargain. The yard went dead quiet. Hannah turned at last and looked at the new hand and watched him understand that he had overplayed it, that in his eagerness to scream about her bread, he'd forgotten to account for the actual thing that had made the actual men sick. What jerky? Hannah said softly. I don't know what he's talking about. The man blustered, backing up a step. Rotten jerky's got nothing to do with I never. That's got nothing to do with the bread being filthy. You just said rotten. Hannah took a step toward him. How'd you know it was rotten if you don't know anything about it? You sold 6 men bad meat and then you rode straight in screaming it was my bread, so that by the time anybody thought to ask the sick men what they ate, the whole county'd already have it fixed in their heads that Carter bread is poison. That was the plan, wasn't it? Who paid you to come out here? Who spoke for you in town? The man broke and ran. He got 4 steps before Cobb the foreman took him down into the dust and knelt on his back and looked up at Hannah with a wholly changed face. Miss Carter, Cobb said, breathing hard. I owe you an apology, and I mean to see, this rat gives up who sent him if I have to sit on him till Sunday. Your bread's the best thing ever happened to this outfit. I'm ashamed I doubted it for a minute. The sick men were pushing themselves up onto their elbows now, watching, and one by one it dawned on them what had near happened. How close they'd come to helping ruin the one person in the county who'd been feeding them right. The gray-faced one, who'd remembered the jerky, spoke up first, hoarse and furious. He come to us all friendly, he rasped. Sold us that meat cheap, real neighborly, and all the while he knew he was making us sick a purpose just to hang it on your bread. He spat into the dust. Cobb, don't you let him up, not till he says the name. Oh, he'll say the name, Cobb said grimly, leaning his weight down. Won't you, friend? Beside Hannah, Sadie Coates was crying. The fear finally breaking loose now that it was over, and Hannah put an arm around the girl's thin shoulders and held her, while the ranch hands, one after another, sick and well alike, told her they were sorry. Told her they'd never doubted her. Really told her. The thing a person can only tell you after they've wronged you and been shown their own smallness. You didn't do this. Hannah told Sadie, quiet, just for her. You hear a whole yard of men just watched an innocent girl not run and not hide and not lie, and it changed their minds about poor farm girls forever. You did that. Standing here. That's what honest looks like. Don't you ever forget you did that. By the time Nathaniel Brooks rode in off the fence line, it was already over the rat-faced man trust and talking. Giving up the name, everybody already knew. A man in town, a banker, $30 to poison a reputation. Nathaniel sat his horse and heard the whole of it, and his face when he looked down at Hannah was a thing she would carry a long while. He tried to burn you down, Nathaniel said, sooner than let you testify against him. He did. And you rode straight out here and put the fire out with the plain truth in front of my whole crew before I even knew there was a fire. He shook his head slow. Miss Carter, I've known strong men my whole life. Men who could break a horse or hold a line against 40 head of stampeding cattle. I don't believe I ever met anybody stronger than you, and you never once raised your voice to do it. I don't have to raise my voice. Hannah looked up at him. I've got the truth, Mr. Brooks. The truth doesn't need shouting. It just needs somebody willing to stand next to it when everybody else runs. She glanced at Sadie, still tucked under her arm. Turns out there's more of us willing than I used to think. Something was happening between them, standing there in that yard, and both of them felt it, and neither one of them said it, because there was a trust man in the dust, and a contract to save, and 100 hungry men, and it was not the time. And maybe there would never be a time. And Hannah told herself she did not care about that, and mostly believed it. Nathaniel rode escort back to town beside the wagon, which he did not need to do. And Hannah noticed, and made nothing of it, and noticed some more. The story of it beat them into Red Willow by an hour, the way stories do, and by the time the wagon rolled in, the whole town knew that Silas Thorne had paid a man to poison the reputation of the woman he'd already tried to rob, and that Hannah Carter had ridden out and undone it with nothing but her wits and the plain truth. And something shifted in the town that day, that had not shifted even when Brooks signed his contract. Because it is one thing to watch a woman get rescued by a rich man. It is another thing entirely to watch her save herself. That was the Saturday. On the Monday, the finest carriage anybody in Red Willow had ever seen came rolling up the Brooks Road, and the woman who stepped out of it changed the size of everything. Her name was Adeline Cross, and she owned Cross & Company, the biggest freight and trading concern between Helena and the Dakotas, a widow who had taken her husband's dyeing business and built it into an empire that supplied half the forts and mining camps and mercantiles in the territory. She had come to Brooks Ranch on other business cattle contracts, and Nathaniel Brooks, in a move Hannah would puzzle over gratefully for the rest of her days, had served this most important woman in the territory a supper that ended with a basket of Carter bread. Mrs. Cross drove into town herself the next morning and walked into Hannah's shop and asked for the baker. "I've eaten bread in Chicago," Adeline Cross said without preamble, a sharp-eyed woman who plainly did not waste words. "I've eaten bread in San Francisco and once memorably in Paris, France. Young woman, I have not eaten bread as good as yours anywhere on this earth, and I have made it my life's work to know the difference between a good thing and a great one." She set a gloved hand on the counter. "So I'll come straight to it the way I come straight to everything. I want to carry your bread. Cross & Company supplies 40 mercantiles and a dozen mining camps across 6 counties. I want Carter bread on every one of those shelves. I'll build you a proper bakehouse. I'll freight it myself, and I'll make you a wealthy woman inside of 2 years." She tilted her head. "What do you say to that?" Hannah stood behind her counter with her bound hands flat on the wood, and for a moment she could not say anything at all. 6 counties, 40 mercantiles, a proper bakehouse, wealthy inside 2 years. It was everything. It was more than everything. It was so far past anything her mother and father had ever dreamed, standing at this same board that it made her dizzy to hold it in her head, and it terrified her down to the ground, because she knew the second the words left Adeline Cross's mouth exactly what it would cost. It would mean debt, real debt, the kind that had a bank's name on it, the kind that had killed her father by inches. It would mean betting the little shop with her parents' name over the door against a bigger thing she could not yet see the shape of. It would mean risking all over again every single thing she had on the same dangerous faith that had already nearly buried her once. She had crawled up out of the mud not 2 months gone. She had a good contract now, honest work a full till a girl she'd saved, and a friend beside her and a man who looked at her one moment too long. She had safety, or the closest thing to it she'd ever known, and Adeline Cross was asking her to gamble it all. Hannah looked at Martha, whose face had gone white with the size of it. She looked at Sadie standing in the back doorway with a mixing bowl frozen in her hands. She thought of her father coughing his life out, telling her the note was near paid, telling her to keep on baking honest, telling her that was how a body won. She thought of him 20 years at this board dreaming small, because small was all a man in his place was allowed to dream. She thought of the mud and Cyrus's boot and the whole town laughing. And she thought, I could say no. I could keep what I've got and be grateful and be safe and never again risk waking up to find the flour bin empty and the wolves at the door. Or, Mrs. Cross, Hannah said slowly, and her heart was hammering the way it had hammered the morning she signed Nathaniel's contract, the way it hammered every time the whole of her life came down to a single hard choice. I need to ask you something first, and I need an honest answer, because I've been lied to by better-dressed people than I can count, and I'll not be lied to again. She looked the woman dead in the eye. When you say you'll make me wealthy, whose name goes over the door? Because there's 2 generations of Carters in that bread, and there's a girl in my back room who nobody else in this whole territory would give a chance, and there's a widow beside me who stood up when standing up cost her everything. Whatever I build with them, and I build it honest, or I don't build it at all. So you tell me, true Mrs. Cross, is this a partnership, or is this just a bigger man buying up a smaller one? Hannah's voice did not rise. It never once rose. Because I have been small my whole life, and I am done being made smaller. I would rather keep my one little shop and my own good name than get rich losing them. So, which is it going to be? Adeline Cross looked at Hannah Carter for a long, long moment. And then slow, the sharp-eyed woman began to smile. A real smile, the first honest one Hannah had seen cross a rich person's face in longer than she could remember. Young woman, Adeline Cross said, I have been waiting 11 years to hear somebody in this territory ask me that question. She put out her gloved hand across the counter. It's a partnership. Carter's name over every door. And God help the fool whoever tries to make you small again, because I've a feeling they'll answer to more than just you now. Hannah looked at that offered hand. She thought of everything it would cost, and everything it might mean, and every single thing that could still go wrong. And she thought of her father, and she thought of the mud, and she thought that a person's whole life is really only a handful of moments when the door swings open, and you have to decide right then, with your heart pounding, and no way to know how it ends, whether you are going to be brave or whether you are going to be safe. Her father had taught her the answer to that a long time ago, at a flour-dusted board in the dark before dawn, though neither of them had known that was the lesson. You put the bread in the window anyway. Hannah Carter reached out her cracked and bleeding and unbroken hand, and she took hold of the future, and she held on. The lawyer came down from Helena on the Thursday stage, a lean gray man named Prentice, who Adeline Cross swore had never lost a case he believed in, and Hannah laid her father's receipt on the table in front of him and watched his eyebrows climb. You understand what you've got here, Prentice said. I understand it says $19 and he told me $140. No, ma'am, what you've got here is a thread. He tapped the seal. And when you pull a thread like this in a man's books, whole garments come apart. If Silas Thorne inflated your note, he's inflated others. Men don't cheat once. They cheat as a habit until somebody catches them. He looked up at her. Are you willing to stand up in a courtroom and be looked at, because he'll put every ugly thing this town ever said about you in front of that judge to make you small, to make you not worth believing, Mr. Prentice? Hannah folded her hands. I have been made small in front of this whole town on my knees in the mud. A courtroom holds no fear for me that a Tuesday morning hasn't already held. Pull your thread. He pulled it. The county judge ordered Thorne's books opened over the banker's every objection, and when Prentice laid the bank's own ledger beside Hannah's father's receipt, The numbers did not match, and a bank's numbers are supposed to match more than anything on this earth. The receipt said 19. The ledger doctored in a different ink said 140. And once that one lie stood exposed in the open air, the others came crawling out behind it like they'd only been waiting to be asked. Because Hannah had been right that first night. Thorne had not done it once. He had been doing it for 30 years. They came forward slow at first, then all at once. A widow whose ranch he'd taken over a note she'd sworn was near paid. Two brothers foreclosed on the very month their luck was turning. Old Amos Dawson himself, who stood up in that courtroom with his hat crushed in his hands and said Silas Thorne had cheated his dead father out of 200 acres, and he'd spent 20 years too ashamed to say so because who'd believe him over a banker? "I'd believe you," Hannah said to him after in the courthouse hall. "I'd have believed you all along, Mr. Dawson." "I know it." The old man's eyes were wet. "That's the shame of it, girl. We all knew you'd believe us. We just none of us had the sand to go first. Took a woman this town spit on to go first." He shook his head. "Lord forgive us." Thorne fought it to the last the way a drowning man fights grabbing at anything. He stood up in his fine coat and told the judge that Hannah Carter was a hysterical woman, an unstable creature that grief had turned her mind that the receipt was surely forged by some enemy of the bank. And Prentice let him talk himself all the way out to the end of the rope, and then he called his witnesses. He called Nathaniel Brooks, who told the court plain how Thorne had come running to break a business deal with a lie. How the banker had sworn the note was 140 when his own receipt said 19, how he'd tried to run a rival off before the truth could come out. He called Cobb the foreman, who told the court about a man paid $30 to poison 6 hands and blame it on Carter bread, and about the name that man had given when they'd trust him in the dust. He called Adeline Cross, who did not even need to be called, who simply stood and informed the judge that Cross and Company would not do $1 of business with any bank. Silas Thorne's hand had touched, and that she suspected the honest men of this county felt the same, and let the whole room understand exactly how alone the banker now stood. And last Prentice called Hannah. She took the stand in her good dress. Her hands still cracked from the ovens, and she did not weep, and she did not rage, and she did not once raise her voice. She told it flat and true. The morning her parents died. The note she'd paid on while eating 1 meal a day. The morning Thorne had looked her in the eye and told her a lie with a seal on it. The receipt her father had tucked into the sourdough page like a lamp in a window. "He needed me to be a joke, Your Honor," Hannah said quiet to the silent room. "He needed this whole town laughing at me so nobody'd look close while he took what my family built. And it very near worked. It works a lot, I expect, on folks like me. On widows and orphans and anybody a town's already decided to be small about." She looked for just a moment at the crowded gallery, at the very faces that had laughed. "The only reason it didn't work this time is my father loved me enough to leave me the truth where he knew I'd find it. Most folks Thorne cheated didn't have a father like mine. That's the only difference between me and them. It ain't that I'm special. It's that I got lucky in my people." The judge ruled before supper. Silas Thorne's charter was pulled, his doctored notes voided one after another, the stolen acres ordered, returned to the families he'd robbed. There was talk of prison, and it came to that in time, though Hannah took no pleasure in the hearing of it. The great iron safe that had held a town in fear for 30 years was opened by the court, and inside it, along with all his lies, was the true accounting of her father's note. $19. Hannah paid it. In cash at the courthouse window, the very last debt her family owed anybody on this earth, and she got a proper receipt for it, and she folded that receipt into the sourdough page of her father's book, right where the other one had lived, so that both of them would always be there, the lie and the truth of it. The whole story in one place, the way her father would have wanted. "You could have let it ride," Prentice told her, gathering his papers. "Once the charter was pulled, nobody'd have chased you for $19. "I know it." Hannah tucked the book under her arm. "But my father paid his debts, Mr. Prentice, every one honest his whole life. I wasn't about to let the last one his daughter owed go unpaid just because the man who held it turned out to be a thief. That's his name over my door. I keep it clean." She put out her hand. Thank you. Truly. Send Mrs. Cross your bill and add something onto it for yourself. After that, everything Hannah built, she built in the daylight with nothing hidden and nobody's thumb on the scale. She built it careful too, which surprised the folks who expected a woman handed such a chance to lose her head. She did not spend wild. She raised the new bakehouse behind the old shop, one honest board at a time, and she kept her parents' little storefront exactly as it was. The faded paint, and all because that was where the family started, and a person ought never be ashamed of where they started. She bought the second oven, and then only when the orders truly demanded it, a third. She hired local families. Women, mostly women. The town had been small about the way it had been small about her, and she paid them fair, and she taught them right, and the bakehouse filled up with people who had somewhere at last to belong. She worked out an arrangement with the valley farmers to grow her grain, so the money stayed in the county, and the flour came fresh, and she made a new bread from it, a dense, dark loaf the miners 2 valleys over took to like. It was Christmas, and she named it after her mother, Ruth's Brown, and she never told a soul why, and it did not matter, because the caring was in it, and folks could taste the caring even if they couldn't name it. And one by one, the town that had laughed came back. They came sheepish. They came holding their nickels out like peace offerings. Grady came himself, the mercantile man, and stood at her counter turning his hat in his hands, the way old Dawson had, and set it low so the shop wouldn't hear. I sold you 20 pounds of flour when you needed 100, Grady said, on the worst morning of your life. And I did it to keep in good with a thief who's going to prison now. He swallowed. I've no right to ask, but I'd take it kindly if you'd sell me a loaf, Miss Carter. My wife's after me to bring home the Carter bread like everybody else, and I can't hardly look her in the eye about it. Hannah wrapped him a loaf. She charged him a nickel, the same nickel, not a penny more. Mr. Grady, she said, sliding it across. You were scared of a powerful man, and you did a small thing to stay on his good side, and it cost a lonely woman a hard morning. That's a real thing, and I won't pretend it isn't. But I've been scared too. I know what it does to a person being scared for their living. So I'll not hold it against you forever if you'll not do it to the next one who comes along scared and alone. That's the only price. You pay it forward, not back. She almost smiled. And you tell your wife the Ruth's Brown keeps 3 days if you wrap it in a cloth. Grady went out with his loaf and his eyes wet, and Hannah suspected a better man than he'd walked in, which was the only revenge she had ever wanted on anybody. Prudence Vale never quite managed the words, but she came to stand in line every Saturday, faithful as church, and one morning she left a jar of her choke cherry preserves on the counter with no note, and Hannah understood that for Prudence Vale that jar was as close to on my knees. I'm sorry, as the woman had in her, and Hannah accepted it in the spirit it was meant, and sent Sadie round the next week with a fresh loaf and no charge, and the 2 women never spoke of any of it, and were in the strange arithmetic of small towns near enough to square. Even Cyrus Deland turned up months on hat in hand needing work. His mother had shamed him to it, folks said, and he stood in the bakehouse door where he'd once loitered to jeer, and he could not hardly get the words out. I heard you was hiring, he mumbled, for the hauling, loading the freight wagons. He looked at his boots. I know I got no right. I know what I done to you. In the mud that morning. I've thought on it. His jaw worked. I've thought on it a lot, tell you the truth. It don't sit good. Martha, standing at Hannah's shoulder, made a low sound that suggested exactly where she thought Cyrus Deland could take his thinking. But Hannah put a hand on the older woman's arm. Hard work, Hannah said to Cyrus. Honest pay. You show up sober, and you treat every soul in this bakehouse, the women, the poor farm girl, everyone with respect, and you'll have a job as long as you want it. You so much as sneer at a one of them, you're gone and no second chance. That's the whole of the deal. She held his eyes. You knocked my bread in the mud, Cyrus. Now you can load it onto wagons that feed 6 counties. Seems to me a man could learn something doing that. If he's willing. Cyrus Deland stared at her like she'd struck him. Why? He finally got out. After what I'd done, why give me anything at all? Because somebody gave me something. Hannah said the morning I had nothing left. A man walked into my shop and looked past everything this town told him about me and just tasted the bread. He didn't owe me that. Nobody owes anybody that. But he did it, and it saved my life." She picked up her peel. "I figure the only way to pay a thing like that back is to hand it on to the next fellow who don't deserve it. Even you, especially you maybe. Now go see Cobb about the wagons, and Cyrus." She waited till he looked up. "Don't waste it, that's all I ask. Don't you waste it." He didn't. That was the part nobody in Red Willow ever quite got over. Cyrus Deland loaded freight for Carter's Bakehouse for 11 years and turned steady and turned decent, and stood up at Sadie Coates's wedding one day to give a toast that made half the room cry, and none of it would have happened if the woman he'd humiliated in the mud had wanted revenge more than she'd wanted the world to be 1 degree kinder than it had been to her. Through all of it, Nathaniel Brooks came and went the way he always had. Only more often, and never once did he give Hannah a thing she hadn't earned. He paid full price for every loaf. He never leaned on Adeline Cross for a better arrangement, never traded on the day he'd saved her, never let her thank him past the first time. "You keep trying to thank me," he told her once, leaning in her doorway. "And I keep telling you the same thing. I bought bread. I got a bargain. There's no debt between us, Hannah Carter, never was. A debt would mean I did you a kindness and I didn't. I did myself one walking into your shop." He settled his hat. "I don't want you grateful. Grateful's for charity, and there was never any charity in it." "Then what do you want, Mr. Brooks?" Hannah said, before she'd quite decided to. And Nathaniel Brooks looked at her a moment, one moment too long the way he always had. "We'll get to that," he said quietly. "When the dust's settled and you've built your bakehouse and this town's had time to learn your name means something. We'll get to that, you and me." He touched his hat brim. "Good day, Miss Carter." And he rode off and left Hannah standing in her doorway with flour on her hands, and her whole chest full of something she was for the first time in her life not the least bit afraid of. She had come up out of the mud. She had buried her parents and paid their last honest debt and put a thief in prison and built a business that fed 6 counties and lifted up every overlooked soul she could get her hands on along the way. And she had done all of it without once trading her dignity for it, without once making herself small, and without once, not one single time, stooping to hand back to that town the cruelty it had handed her. That was the victory. Not the money, not the contracts, not even the thief brought low. It was that she had won without becoming anything her father would not have recognized standing at that board in the dark. She had kept the name clean. She had kept on baking honest, exactly like he told her. And the whole territory had come around at last to the plain truth Tommy Pruitt had known when he was 7 years old, and nobody else in Red Willow could see it. The bread had been the best all along. They'd just had to get out of their own way to taste it. A year did to Red Willow what a year does, which is to say, it rearranged everything and pretended it had always been that way. By the following spring, there was no busier place in the county than the Carter Bakehouse, and no more respected name. The freight wagons rolled out 3 mornings a week now, Cyrus Deland driving the lead one, steady as a church clock, and Carter bread sat on mercantile shelves in towns Hannah had never seen and never would. She'd made Martha a full partner put it in writing with Prentice, so nobody could ever question it. And the day Martha Hollis saw her own name beside Carter's on the paper, she'd sat right down on a flour sack and wept like a girl. 40 years I kept my head down in this town," Martha said, wiping her eyes. "And you go and put my name on a business. I don't hardly know how to walk upright, Hannah. I'm out of practice." "You'll learn," Hannah said. I did. Sadie Coates had grown into the finest baker Hannah had ever trained, better than Hannah herself in some things. And that summer, she married a young farmer from the valley who grew the grain for Ruth's Brown. And the whole bakehouse turned out for the wedding, and Cyrus Deland stood up and gave a toast about second chances that had grown men blowing their noses into their sleeves. Tommy Pruitt, 12 now, and shot up like a weed apprenticed after school, and swore up and down he'd run his own Carter Bakehouse in another town someday, and Hannah told him she'd hold him to it and meant it. She kept the old storefront just as it was through all of it. Faded paint her parents' names. She could have torn it down and raised something grand, and folks told her she ought to, and she told them no. That was where the family started, and a person keeps the place they started even when they no longer need it. especially then. And every single morning, no matter how many hired hands filled that bakehouse, Hannah Carter lit the great brick oven herself. She would not let another soul do it. She'd strike the match in the dark before dawn, the way she had the night the whole town gathered to watch her fall, and she'd hold the small flame a moment, and think of her father, and lay the fire. And it was the one part of the whole enterprise she would never hand to anybody, because that match was the truest thing she owned. It was the morning she'd decided not to quit. She lit it fresh every day so she'd never forget she'd once had to choose. The only thing in all her life that Hannah did not let herself hope for was the one thing Nathaniel Brooks had left hanging in her doorway a year before. "We'll get to that, you and me." She had turned those words over 10,000 times in the dark, kneading when there was nobody to see her face. And every time the old voice came up under them, the voice this town had put in her, the voice that had told her since she was a girl that a woman shaped like her did not get that. Business, yes. Respect may be hard won. But not that. Not a good man's heart, plain and freely given. That was for the Prudence Vales of the world, the Slim Reeds, the women who kept themselves. Not for her. Never for her. So she had built everything else instead, and told herself it was enough, and mostly believed it. He came on a Sunday evening after the bakehouse had closed, and the last wagon was loaded for Monday, and everyone had gone home, and there was only Hannah wiping down the old board her grandfather had worked alone in the shop with her parents' names on the wall. She heard the boots on the boardwalk. She knew them before the bell rang. "We're closed, Mr. Brooks," she said, not turning around, her heart already going the foolish way it had gone the first morning he'd walked in. "Even for you. I didn't come for bread." He took off his hat. He stood there just inside the door, and for a man who had faced down a stampede and a corrupt banker and a whole town of small people, without blinking, Nathaniel Brooks looked of a sudden about as nervous as Hannah had ever seen a grown man look. "I came because the dust settled, Hannah. Your bakehouse is built. This whole territory knows your name means something. I said I'd wait for all that. Well, it's here. I ran clean out of reasons to keep waiting." Hannah set down her cloth. She made herself turn around. She made herself look at him. "Waiting for what?" she said, though her voice came out not near as steady as she wanted it. "You know what? I don't. I've been lied to enough in my life that I've stopped guessing at what people mean and started making them say it." She lifted her chin, the old armor coming up out of pure habit. "So say it plain, Mr. Brooks, or don't say it at all. I'm too old and too tired to be teased." Nathaniel Brooks was quiet a moment. And then he crossed the shop slow and stopped an honest arm's length from her, close enough that she had to look up at him, and he turned his hat around and around in his hands. "You want it plain," he said. "All right, I'll give it to you plain, and you can do with it what you will." He took a breath. "I've eaten your bread every day for near a year. 112 hard men and me 3 meals a day, all of it your bread. And I want to tell you what it does out there on that ranch at the end of a day that's tried to break a man." "Nathaniel, let me finish. I've been a year working up to it." His jaw was tight. "There's men on my crew never had a mother worth the name. Men been called worthless their whole lives, been kicked and cheated and told they don't matter, same as this town told you. And they come in off that range half dead, and there's your bread on the table. Bread somebody made. Careful. Made like it mattered. Made like they mattered. And I have watched hard men go quiet over a heel of your bread, Hannah. I have watched them remember they're worth feeding, right? You do that. Every loaf. You take people the world threw away, and you feed them like they're worth something because you know what it is to be thrown away, and you decided a long time ago you'd not do it back." Hannah's eyes were burning now, and she could not stop them. "That's the bread," she managed. "You're describing the bread." "No." His voice dropped and roughened, and he stopped turning the hat. "That's the woman. I stopped being able to tell them apart a long while back. That's what I came to say." He looked at her, and there was nothing in his face now but the plain truth of it laid bare the way she demanded. "I didn't fall in love with you because you saved my ranch from that gray Miller slop. And I surely didn't fall in love out of pity, whatever this town said, because there was never 1 ounce of pity in it. I told you that, and I meant it." He shook his head slow. I fell in love with the woman who lit that oven every single morning, back when not one soul in Red Willow believed she could. When the whole town was outside your window laughing, waiting for you to quit. You lit the fire anyway. I heard about it before I ever tasted a crumb, and something in me stood up and paid attention, and it's been standing at attention ever since. He said it. I love you, Hannah Carter. Have for a year. It's the plainest thing I know. The shop was very quiet. Hannah stood there with her grandfather's board at her back and her parents' names on the wall, and a year of not letting herself hope crumbling all at once inside her chest. And the old voice tried one last time to rise. The voice that said, "Not you, never you, look at you." She heard it. And then she did the thing she had spent a year learning how to do, the thing she was better at now than baking, even better than anything. She let it go. "You know what this town taught me?" she said, and her voice shook, and she let it shake. "It taught me I'd get the bakery maybe if I fought hard enough. It'd let me have that. But not this, never this. A woman like me doesn't get looked at the way you're looking at me right now. I've believed that my whole life. I built a whole empire so I wouldn't have to want it." A tear went down her face and she let it. "And here you stand, making a liar out of everything I ever believed about myself." "Then believe me instead," Nathaniel said. "I'm standing right here. I'm a lot harder to argue with than a voice in your own head." A sound came out of Hannah that was half a laugh and half a sob. "That's the truest thing you've ever said." And here was the thing she understood standing in that shop that she had not understood in all the year of her rising. She had thought once that the victory would be the day the town that laughed had to eat its words. She'd thought beating them was the prize, but the town's apology when it came had tasted of nothing. Prudence's jar of preserves. Grady's wet eyes, the long Saturday lines, none of it had filled the hole. Because you cannot fill that hole from the outside. She knew that now. It was never about proving them wrong. The victory, the real one, the only one that had ever mattered, was that somewhere in that hardest year, she had stopped letting them hold the pen. She had stopped letting a town of small people decide what Hannah Carter was worth. And once a woman does that, once she truly does it all the way down, then the apologies don't matter, and the laughing doesn't matter. And even a good man's love, when it comes, doesn't arrive as proof of anything. It just arrives as itself. As a gift she could finally take with both hands, because she no longer needed it to tell her she was worth taking. "Say it again," Hannah said. "The plain part. I want to hear it standing up straight this time, not braced for it." Nathaniel Brooks almost smiled. "I love you, Hannah Carter." She reached up her strong, cracked hands, her father's hands, and she took the hat right out of his and set it on the board so he'd have nothing left to turn. "Then you'd best come courting proper Nathaniel Brooks," she said, "because I've a business to run and I don't have time for a man who can't make up his mind. Sunday suppers. You'll bring the beef, I'll bring the bread. And you'll meet Martha's approval, which I warn you is harder to earn than mine." Her voice broke clean open on the last of it. "And you'll never ever, so long as you live, call the thing between us charity or pity or luck, because it isn't. It's the plainest, truest thing either of us has got. You said so yourself." "I did," he said, "and I'll say it every Sunday and a good many days between till you're sick to death of hearing it." "I won't get sick of hearing it." She was crying and laughing both now, the way Martha had the day of the papers. "That's the terrible part. I've waited my whole life. I don't expect I'll ever get sick of it at all." He kissed her then, in the closed-up shop with her parents' names on the wall, and the mother starter bubbling slow in its crock, and a year of honest bread baked into the very timbers of the place. And it was not the kiss of a man doing a poor woman a kindness. And Hannah, who had spent 26 years being told she'd never have such a thing, knew the difference all the way to the bottom of her soul. They stepped out onto the boardwalk, after into the cool of the Sunday evening, and stood there together a while, not saying much, watching the town settle down for the night. The same town, the same street where she'd once gone to her knees in the mud to save one honest loaf, while the whole of Red Willow laughed. She could stand in that exact spot now and feel not one thing, but a kind of peace And that, more than the wagons or the contracts or the man beside her, was how she knew she was free. "Penny for what you're thinking," Nathaniel said. "I'm thinking," Hannah said slowly, "about a girl on her knees in that mud right there a year gone. Everybody laughing, not a soul to help her." She was quiet a moment. "I used to want to go back and tell her it turns out all right. The bakehouse, the money, you, all of it. But I don't anymore." No, because if I told her it turns out all right, she might have quit the fighting, waited on the rescue." Hannah shook her head. She needed to not know. She needed to light that oven, not because she was sure it'd work, but because lighting it was the only honest thing left to do. "That's the whole of what I've got to give anybody in the end. Not that it turns out all right. Nobody can promise that." She looked up at him. "Only that you light the oven anyway. You do the honest thing anyway. You put the bread in the window anyway, and you let them look, and you don't let their laughing tell you what you're worth. That's it. That's everything I know." Nathaniel Brooks looked down at the woman beside him, the one this whole town had once agreed to throw away, who had refused quietly and completely, and without ever once raising her voice to be thrown. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than most folks learn in a whole life." And Hannah Carter, who had buried her parents and been laughed into the mud and cheated by a thief, and rebuilt from a single day's flour into the most respected name in 6 counties, and had done all of it without surrendering 1 inch of her dignity or 1 ounce of her kindness, understood at last the plain truth her father had been trying to hand her all along at that flour-dusted board in the dark before dawn. A person's worth was never in the shape of them, nor in the size of them, nor in what a town of small and frightened people decided to make of them on their cruelest morning. It was in the character of them, in whether they kept their word and paid their debts and fed the throne away like they mattered and lit the fire again every single day the world gave them reason to quit. She had that. She'd had it all along, and no one, not the banker, not the town, not the meanest voice in her own head, had ever once been able to take it, because it was the one thing on this earth that could not be taken, only given away. And Hannah Carter had never once, not on her worst morning, given it away. They laughed at her bread that first day. The whole town laughed. But in the end, it was Hannah Carter, standing tall in the life she'd built, with her own 2 honest hands, loved plainly by a good man and respected across a territory, and free at last of every judgment ever laid on her, who had the last word, and the last word was this: they were wrong about her from the very beginning, and it never once mattered, because she had never once needed them to be right.